Hello and welcome back to the second episode of the Green Sofa Dialogues. My name is Jennifer Porto, and joining me today for a very special Green Sofa talk is Claire Mack, Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. Claire, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you. Really delighted to be able to come and have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you with us from Glasgow. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Yes, I'm in a slightly overcast Glasgow here today, but it's still pretty warm for this time of year for us here in Glasgow. Yeah.
I thought maybe we could start off talking a little bit about Scottish Renewables. Perhaps you could give us a brief introduction to what Scottish Renewables is and what you do.
Absolutely. So Scottish Renewables is the voice of Scotland's renewable energy industry, and our vision is for a Scotland leading the world in renewables. And that might sound quite bold and quite ambitious, but Scotland has always continually shown pretty strong ambition as far as kind of climate change and development of renewable energy has been. And a lot of that's to do with the abundance of natural resources that we have at our disposal here in Scotland. You know, we genuinely have access to all of the different natural resources that we need to develop renewable energy, be that wind, sunshine, tidal power, as well as wave power is another thing that we're devising here. Hydropower as well. We have heavy rainfall. You know, there's no secret about that here in Scotland, but that's actually really good for running things like hydro schemes, which we have a real abundance of here in Scotland. And we're working to grow Scotland's renewable energy industry and sustain its position at the forefront of the global clean energy industry. And we do that by delivering investment. We do that by delivering jobs. And we do that by cutting carbon emissions, and also kind of all the wider social benefits that we're now all coming to recognise that come alongside kind of tackling climate change. So my members are involved in energy technologies across the whole sphere of renewable energy in Scotland. They're also reaching out into the UK, into Europe, and around the rest of the world as well. And in representing them, we're hoping to kind of lead the debate and take it forward about the growth of renewable energy and help to sustainably heat and power Scotland, and hopefully be able to take some of that knowledge out to the rest of the world as well.
Thank you so much for that brief introduction. You mentioned heating and cutting emissions, and I want to get to that in just a second. But I want to also talk a little bit. So Scotland had the target of having 100% of its electricity demand from renewables in 2020, and it didn't quite get there. I think it was right around 97%. They missed the target a little bit. Can you talk about how are things looking then to get to 100%? How is generally the Scottish energy transition going?
Yeah, so it's really exciting, and we're really proud to have got to 97.4%. It is, don't forget that. And so we're hoping to see probably towards the end of this year how much more progress we've made towards 100% of renewables. But Scotland's got a real success story in here, in that we've trebled our renewable energy generation capacity, our renewable energy capacity in the last decade. So from 2010 to 2020, we've seen a tripling of our energy capacity from about 4 gigawatts up to about 12 today. So it's really, really exciting stuff. And there are plans in place to really accelerate that and push it forward in the coming decade, because this next decade is really, really important as far as tackling climate change goes. And Scotland has decarbonised, and since 2008, Scotland has decarbonised quicker than any other G20 country. Again, something that we're really, really proud of. And a lot of that progress has been made as a result of the targets. There was a really ambitious target put in place for 2020 that we would be generating the equivalent of 100% of our electricity demand from renewables by 2020. And as you said, we missed that ever so slightly, but hopefully by December we'll have seen even more progress towards that target, because there's a lot more in place now, and more ambitions, as in Scotland has obviously signed up to going to net zero by 2045, which is 5 years earlier than the rest of the UK. And that recommendation was made on the basis of the natural resources which I've been talking about, which we have access to here in Scotland. So renewable power generation at the moment is displacing about the equivalent carbon emissions of the entire transport sector. And our sort of research shows as well that for every gigawatt of renewable energy that we generate here in Scotland, we create 1,500 jobs and deliver about 133 million GVA to our economy. Again, a fact that we're really, really proud of. The job doesn't stop there. What I'm talking about here is electricity demand. We know that energy demand as a whole is much wider, so that does cover heat and transport, like you say, and those are the next big challenges for us to take on board and to work away on, to genuinely achieve that net zero ambition by 2045.
It sounds like some fantastic accomplishments so far, and I want to talk about some of those plans. I heard you say in a transition talk that you did last fall, and I want to read this: the best kilowatt hour is the unused kilowatt hour. I really loved it. I had to go back and watch this again. I thought that was a really fantastic way to sum it up, because heating is one of the two sectors, along with transportation, that contributes the most to carbon emissions. How can we cut those carbon emissions, as we're talking now in terms of heating? We can also talk about transport if you'd like, but what plans does Scotland have to cut some emissions in heating and transport?
So, let's say electricity is only about a quarter of our wider energy use in Scotland. More than half of what we use goes on actually keeping us warm, and the other quarter goes on that transport sector. So, really making headway into that heating issue is the key way of doing that. And Scotland has passed some really interesting legislation over the last year or so to create heat networks. So, those are pretty prevalent actually across Europe. You certainly see in cities like Copenhagen, they have very widespread kind of heat networks. And that's something that we're trying to look at here. And we've identified a number of sites here in Scotland, nearly 50 places in Scotland, where we could use heat networks as a solution to be able to help us decarbonise that next piece of the puzzle. The vast majority of heat at the moment in Scotland is provided by burning natural gas, and of course transport uses fossil fuels as well, primarily petrol and diesel, in order to be powered and to take people to all the places that we want to go. But we do know that we need to make progress, hopefully using the technologies that we have now. We have got all the technologies that we need. We've got heat pumps and electric vehicles, as well as keeping an eye on the future. There are some new energy and fuel sources that are coming through, like hydrogen, which we're not sure of the scale at which and what their kind of deployment scenarios will look like yet, but that is accelerating at real pace, the thinking around about new energy sources such as hydrogen.
I want to talk a little bit more in just a little bit about some of the technologies that are going to drive Europe's energy transition. But before we transfer to a more European outlook, I want to talk a little bit more about Scotland. I know that Aberdeen has received some incredible funding recently to help them meet the Scottish Government's climate goals or climate change targets. Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So Aberdeen's a really, really interesting city, and it's a place that, while we're based in Glasgow, I'm working really, really intensively with colleagues up in Aberdeen. And the reason for that is that Aberdeen has been the kind of energy powerhouse of Scotland, if not just Scotland, but actually the wider world for the last 40 to 50 years through the oil and gas sector. Now, that's a sector that's still going to be really, really important as we go through the energy transition. So that's basically where we move our economy away from being powered by fossil fuels and towards being predominantly powered by renewables, a renewables-led economy. But underneath the skin of all of that is we've got hundreds of different organisations and companies. We have about 100,000 people who work in oil and gas, and it's really important to make sure that those people are at the heart of that energy transition, because their skills are not redundant. They can be adapted. They can be adapted into this new world. And really, that's what we're talking about is an energy revolution and taking people with us as we go, which means moving, like I say, from that energy system powered by fossil fuels into a low carbon one. So renewables are now the electricity industry in Scotland. The vast majority of electrical power now is, as I said, comes from renewable sources. And Aberdeen is already very much at the centre of that. Some of the first offshore wind sites, which are really, really exciting, these are delivering huge chunks of power into the grid. These offshore wind sites are being developed off the east coast around about Aberdeen. Like say, people and skills, we have great human capital that we're able to access as a result of the oil and gas sector. So people who already have skills and expertise in working offshore, who are able to transition into our industry, if we can adapt that skills base, that would be perfect. It's also now becoming more famous as the UK's hydrogen capital, for example, with the world's first fleet of double-decker hydrogen buses. courses launched in January of this year. And of course, like I say, all those people who are in jobs who will be looking for new careers. So we've done a bit of research and we've found that there's quite a strong appetite. I think about 3/4 of people who work in oil and gas recognise that their industry is transitioning and recognise that there is an opportunity in renewables and are very positive about making that jump if there are supports in place for them to do that. So we're working with various different skills agencies, with government, and we're working with government around making sure that there are funds available for people to transition through transition training funds, and also trying to map out just where the skills demand might come. The energy industry in the past has been pretty volatile. A lot of that's been driven by pricing in oil and gas. That's something that you can kind of remove when you get into the renewable space. But that's not to say that our deployment pipeline hasn't been without its bumps either. We're very dependent on policy to make sure we can deploy when and where we want to. It takes a coming together of a lot of different policies in order to get a renewable energy project in place. And those are the kind of things that we're working with government on to try and create a smooth transition and a strong pipeline of projects that will include all of the skills and industries that we have already sitting in Aberdeen to help drive those projects forward.
What I love so much is that it seems like you're really taking, you said this yourself, you're taking people with you. You're looking at making sure that the human capital that you have isn't forgotten as you go through this transition. You talk about hydrogen, you talk about electricity, you've talked about European heat networks. What other technologies do you see that might play a major role in driving the energy transition in Europe?
Europe, yeah, I mean, so Europe is not all that different to us. High ambitions in terms of renewable energy technologies, access to various different natural resources, and I think that's the point that we're starting to see coming through, is that this next decade will very much be driven by the technologies that we already have. Solar, wind, and hydro. We see a lot of hydro, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. We're starting to see new strides coming forward in terms of things like wave and tidal technology. Scotland is a real hotbed for the development of wave and tidal technology, and actually the world's most powerful tidal turbine has just commissioned and started feeding into the grid from Orkney just this week, which is really exciting. And there's still a lot of development pathway for that technology to move forward, and we're working very closely with the EU in all of that. We're also starting to see real strides being happening in terms of battery technology, in terms of transport, as well as, let's say, that development of hydrogen. And one of the key kind of complexities and one of the key challenges that we really need to crack over the next decade and looking forward into the decade after that, from 2030 to 2040, is how to blend all of these technologies together, how to create an energy system out of these different technologies. And through that, we need to also think about a storage system. So one of the key challenges you will always have with a renewables-led system is that renewables do have intermittency, that sometimes the sun doesn't shine, sometimes the wind doesn't blow, but as we learn more about these technologies, we can work out how to build them together in a kind of patchwork to complement each other, in different places and at different times of day. But also alongside that, pulling together, more development of storage technologies and bringing those in as well to really create this renewable-led energy system, of which things like EVs, car batteries, won't just power cars. They will actually become an active part of the energy system, which is really, really exciting. So if you think through, where as a person this might go, I could have solar panels on the roof of my house, which could power my electric vehicle, which I could then drive to a city where a number of people are, so there's a high demand for energy there. I can discharge what's in my car into the city, for everybody to use from a car park that again will have maybe solar panels or smaller turbines or other forms of technology, renewable technology on it. Will recharge my car for my drive home, and again then I can discharge my car to power my house at night. These changes are really, really exciting, and it means a new kind of energy system, one that actually people will very much be involved in a way that they just haven't been to now, because the decarbonisation of electricity has very much happened, at a systems level, almost away from the public. Whereas these next two stages, the decarbonisation of transport and the decarbonisation of heat, are going to need people to do things. It's going to need them to make active choices about their energy use, about, coming back to that point you were making about, the best hours, the unused kilowatt hours. So, just changing behaviours so that you reduce your energy use, and you can manage more of it yourself, through the different tools that will come to become available to you, with EVs being a very obvious one, but there'll be other ones that will be developed over time that we as consumers will start to use to become, really actively part of the new energy system, the new net zero energy system.
I'm sitting here getting really excited. I just came back from a number of weeks in the United States, which is where I'm from, and we spent a lot of time driving in cars, which is how you get around in the States. And we saw so many electric vehicles out and about. We were talking about the future of what it's like to travel in a country the size of the States, or on the European continent, and making your battery in your electric car really a part of exactly what you were saying. How do we get people there? How do we convince people, okay, you're going to need to recharge your battery and it'll take 45 minutes, or if the technology is not there, to do it more quickly? How do we get people there?
Yeah, it's a really, really good point, in that there's a huge opportunity here as well, which is an economic opportunity for infrastructure build out, and that is absolutely going to underpin it. And it's not something that we're unused to. If you look at the revolution in terms of mobile communications, for example, 20 years ago I wasn't charging a phone, and now I do. I recognise that I look at my day, I see where I'm going to be, I see what my needs are going to be for that day, and I adjust accordingly. I make sure if I need extra charge, that I take something with me in terms of a battery, or I make sure I land somewhere at some point in the day, and build my day around that. And it won't be that much different for that, taking people with us in terms of that technology space. And I think, I'm a big believer in technology, and we're now, if you look at the power of things that nowadays, like apps that help support our lifestyles, I have apps that support pretty much everything that I do. So I run my schedule through them, I monitor my health through them, and all of that data that I just kind of didn't know about before, but once it's there and it's processed for me, it makes it a lot easier for me to manage my life. And that's how this is all going to work, is that we're going to use a blend of technologies. But that also means that we need to grow technologies, in parallel. So things like growing 5G technology alongside smart energy systems, because they're going to be dependent on each other, to be able to alert people to where there might be a free charging point, available to them to be able to use at the time, on their journey route, or close to their journey route. But it might also be, just to help with preferences as well, as in, if you are on a journey, stopping somewhere that suits you, that works for you, that you can get the kind of food that you like, and be able to, get the sort of space that you like to be able to work in. Over the pandemic, we've sort of seen just how flexible things like work can be. And I think that's given us a really good taste, or almost a postcard from the future, I guess, of what we might be doing in years to come, which is managing our lifestyles in a different way, which will hopefully manage them in a way that's better for well-being. Tackling climate change is undoubtedly great for well-being, being able to reduce, particulates within the air, and being able to just make our, hopefully stabilize our weather patterns, which will be good for well-being, across the globe. But also the opportunities that come with thinking about a kind of lower carbon lifestyle will also mean that actually there'll be wider health benefits for us from a kind of work-life balance and a well-being perspective. So I guess that's how we'll take people with us, is that this will be better than what's gone before.
I can't help but really smile. I love your enthusiasm, and yes, I think you're right. We can take people with us. And this is, you talk about managing your lifestyles differently. And the pandemic has taught us a lot about how we want to be in our daily lives and how we want to interact with others. When we start to look at the recovery, how can the energy sector, sort of power Europe's recovery in terms of cutting emissions?
So, powering the recovery, I think I've sort of already outlined where the socioeconomic benefits lie. in terms of renewable energy. And I talked a little bit there about infrastructure builds. So one of the other things that happens away from people is very much where the energy networks sit. And that's all the pipework that kind of gets electrons from A to B. And because of renewable energy being a completely, it maps totally differently to thermal energy and fossil fuel energy of the past. And it's all over, it's everywhere. And it generally is at the fringes of the country. It certainly is in Scotland. So we're pulling in the best kind of wind speeds across the north of Scotland and down the east coast. And then you've got opportunities, say, for wave and tidal in the future, which again sit around the kind of coastal areas. And all of that needs really, heavy infrastructure to help it get to where it needs to be. And some of that will be assisted on land, say by topping up through sort of solar and wind, onshore wind, and then battery technologies as well. But also we're going to need to do these huge build programs. And that's the kind of, that's the unseen bit of this, which is that if you look across the kind of energy network companies, already, they're planning, they plan in sort of 5-year cycles, but generally think in kind of decade-long, if not longer, cycles. And they've already committed to billions of pounds worth of investment. And these are great, core skills. Again, in Scotland and across Europe, we actually have in abundance, it's electrical engineering skills, it's civil engineering skills, and actually those kind of offshore engineering skills as well that we've grown through the oil and gas sector. So that's where the real kind of economic opportunity lies. Let's not forget about heat as well, particularly in the UK. We have got a gas-led system, and transitioning that means that we will reskill people for jobs for the future, which means we'll keep people, for another 20 to 30 years in working in that sector, just through being able to allow them to manage their transition too, and building out new infrastructure to support the rollout of decarbonisation of heat is also another huge economic opportunity. And that's where we really see it, is this acceleration in terms of renewables, because again, these are really good jobs, strong jobs in sort of construction and civil engineering, and then also these other jobs in terms of rolling out of new technologies, but then servicing them as well. Let's not forget the operations and maintenance cycle of a renewable energy project is really lengthy. That can be 20, 25 years. And all of the kind of heat technologies that we're going to be using will still need serviced in the same way that all of our gas technologies need service just now. So I'm pretty hopeful that we've got a really strong, sound basis for an economic plan, an economic recovery plan, which will not just deliver on those socioeconomic benefits, will also deliver on huge carbon emissions reductions as well, which is another thing that we know is needed.
Plans. The EU, the European Commission just adopted a package of proposals, Fit for 55. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about Fit for 55 as we start looking towards COP26 later this year. Do you think that the Fit for 55 package can put the EU on a path to meeting its climate targets?
Yeah, no, I think, and one of the great things has always been, if you just look back to the Paris Agreement and whatever, you can see that there's always been a high ambition at a European level, and it's great to see this whole package of measures of draft legislation for cutting, obviously, greenhouse gas emissions from the bloc. We're not experts on EU policy here at Scottish Renewables. I can tell you more about what we do here in Scotland and that decarbonisation journey that we've taken to date, and just hopefully be able to work with our European colleagues as well to be able to help them deliver that. We've maintained economic growth while transitioning to 97% renewable electricity here in Scotland. We've got the skills and knowledge to do that, and it's something that the rest of the EU needs too. And it's something that when we started to look across the board, we could see that there's not only sort of economic opportunity there in terms of export, which is great, to maintain those kind of export links within Europe, but also there's a value set as well, isn't there? Because we're not just doing this for, the economic benefits are great, and obviously that's a really key driving reason, but we know that what we have to do here, it's about international cooperation, isn't it? And it's been the same, through tackling the pandemic. We cannot tackle climate change as individual countries. We have to do, globally coordinated action, and that's where the work of the EU is absolutely pivotal here in trying to sort of help us to get to where we need to be. We already know that Europe's got real strength in terms of things like wind turbine manufacture and O&M, particularly in kind of Denmark and Germany. And we've got those companies very active here in Scotland. And of course, I talked about Copenhagen. 98% of the place is heated by district heating. That's something that we would like to emulate here. So it's going to go backwards and forwards. There's things that we can both offer each other. The central tenet of the Fit for 55 programme is, of course, carbon pricing. And it's great to see somebody starting to really think about tackling that and to look as widely as possible. I think that was one of the things that we did really need to build on from the Paris Agreement was bringing other elements into that kind of that space, because we'd sort of carved out things like aviation and very difficult to decarbonize industries. Everybody recognizes that we're now at a place where we have to find solutions for those, and that's where if you can use the kind of research and development might of something like Europe, the European structure is phenomenal for that. Bringing together academia, bringing together innovative companies, and driving that, through having really strong targets, but also, that innovation infrastructure as well is really, really strong at EU level. Whilst we were in the EU, Scotland and the UK seriously benefited from that, and it's something that through all of the negotiations that went on around about the UK leaving the EU, that was one of the key conversations, was maintaining those sorts of links, because they are so vitally important. But that's kind of one of the key things that is going to come through, I think, as well from COP is that kind of pricing mechanism. There's a lot of chat around about, it probably won't necessarily be renewable engineers who deliver net zero. It will be the accountants too, because that financial infrastructure and that financial system really is super important when you get into the space as well.
The idea of cooperation and working together as we innovate and as we continue along in the energy transition is so very important. COP26. Let's talk a little bit about what's going to be happening at COP26. You talked about accountants saving the world, also the engineers, but the accountants are going to do it. How do we encourage people or how do we encourage investments in renewables to get those accountants on board? How do we do that?
Right. So investment is always driven by certainty. Policy, commitment, and clear regulatory structures, clear ambitions, and government being very much part of that solution. And so that's where that's going to come from. I think as well, if you look at just the changing shape of investment across the world, renewables have become, they've come from a space where people have perhaps seen them as more risky, are now coming into that space where people recognise that they're going to deliver returns over very lengthy periods of time. Good starts, steady, solid returns over a period of time. Policy is crucially important to all of this, and it's something that we've really seen here in the UK. We've seen a bit of bounciness in terms of policy towards renewables, and it really has impacted deployment scenarios. We are now in that place where politicians recognise and that you don't just decide to do a renewable energy project and then 2 years later that's it in place. It's not the same as perhaps as building a road or something of that nature. These things take a long time to develop, sometimes up to 10 years. We're looking to shorten that cycle. Of course we are, as an industry. That's one of our key objectives, is shortening the amount of time it takes, from conception to actual generation of a project. And again, that will drive investment. We've seen incredible cost reductions in things like offshore wind and solar and onshore wind too, as a result of investments made by my industry, which is now taking the eyes of the rest of the investment industry with them and starting to get them really, really interested in what we are doing. And so those are all really, industry's proven that it's capable. It's really capable of delivering, and what we need to do is deliver at pace now. So that's the next big challenge is moving things faster, and so that we can stand ourselves in good stead of really, really working to combat climate change and to try and stabilise weather patterns as we go. And like I say, policy really, really important. So as a result of policy changes, you could see that the UK fell out of the EY RECI index, which is the renewable energy index, when the UK government made a determination to push offshore wind out of its energy procurement mechanism. And so that really caused, a dip across, a noticeable dip that was noticeable across, numerous markets, not just within the UK, and something that investors noticed, and hopefully something that government then recognised was a difficult decision to have made if you're looking to attract investment into the market. It's now back. We're now back up at number 5, having fallen out the top 10, back up at number 5. And that's the kind of impact of political and policy decisions, and how they can really, drive the fortunes, I guess, in terms of that investment picture.
So let's speak a little bit about policy implementation and policy changes and the impact that they make. What kind of policy do we need to see? What kind of changes do we need to see at COP26?
So COP26 is a hugely exciting opportunity. I'm so delighted that it's coming to Glasgow, and after, obviously a year later than we'd anticipate. Which is in some ways a really good thing, in that what's different now is that we've got America back at the table. Really important. They're really, really important. And we've also got this kind of race to the top going on between America and China to really kind of, show their prowess in this area, which I think is phenomenal. Those two things, they're really going to drive this. And so it's COP26, obviously the biggest summit that the UK has ever hosted. Our world leaders will be around the table, and we'll be reporting back on progress. And there was a lot of large unresolved issues from COP25, but the agreements made about cutting carbon dioxide are there. The principles are in place. I think everybody, all the science is well understood, which is great. It is now about creating those kind of infrastructures that are, and I use that in a widest possible term, not just, building stuff. It's about looking at the financial infrastructures too. And I think that probably is one of the key areas that we need to think about. I think as well, COP26 really does need to think about the, not just mitigation, but adaptation. That's a really important part of this, and understanding where those costs fall, because there are huge costs. We know that there are huge costs to not acting quickly enough, and that is really important. So being able to drive targets across many different nations, hugely important, and we're seeing a lot of work going on. I've been quite close to the work that Alok Sharma has been doing here in the UK on a diplomatic route, and again, that's where having that additional year has been really helpful to him, to be able to go and have so many more kind of bilateral meetings. We know that was one of the great successes of the Paris Agreement was the diplomacy that went in ahead of time, and we've bought ourselves a bit more time in order to be able to do that. So I think that's really exciting. And we want to make sure, of course, that cutting carbon emissions will be at the centre of COP, but making great strides in terms of being able to facilitate that, which is getting that kind of financial policy right. If I look at the UK at the moment, we have a kind of an odd system where we're sort of not creating the right incentive in the right place. So all of our sort of tax reliefs sit on the side of gas, and all of our policy costs in terms of decarbonisation sit on the side of electricity, and we need to flip that, and being able to to create a wider kind of infrastructure where that becomes the norm, and where you just incentivize what you want is going to be really, really important. So I think we need to look to COP to be able to do that. The other thing that's really important for COP comes back again to that, what's the next steps in terms of decarbonisation. It's a really exciting prospect, really exciting thing for us to host here in the UK, but getting people excited about it. We saw real encouragement. I was really encouraged when I saw the kind of climate strike marches and went on one, with my own children, because I just knew that this was a real pivotal thing for us as a global, as global citizens, and really important for them to understand that. And that's also a really important part of COP, is using the excitement and the buzz around COP to engage people. And we at Scottish Renewables, that's one of our key ambitions for COP, is to be able to engage people, not just in Glasgow, looking out the rest of Scotland, because the whole of Scotland has a renewable story to tell. And that's what's really, really brilliant about this, is that each and every individual, whilst they look at COP and think, what's that got to do with me? It's got everything to do with you. And how do you contribute to COP? Well, people across Scotland contribute to COP because they live in and around these projects, these renewable energy projects, because they generally do sit in our more rural areas, and everybody who can be impacted by a renewable energy project, whether that be through the build phase, where we're transporting really big bits of kit, and then they engage with it in different ways as it goes forward. Sometimes they use paths that are created as a result of these projects, but that's their contribution. Supporting renewables is a kind of every person's way of contributing to COP, and using that buzz from COP to get people to understand more about what their own choices mean, understand more about what options are available to them, because if they genuinely want to be actively part of their own decarbonisation journey, just giving people information and giving them the sort of platforms that they need to be able to make good decisions is really crucially important. So COP, there's a lot resting on COP. We know that. We absolutely know that. And this is, as a lot of people are talking about, is very much our sort of last chance, really, to be able to broker the kinds of deals that we need to do to make net zero happen, and for us to be able to really avoid the absolutely the worst of the catastrophic effects of climate change. But I'm really hopeful. I'm hopeful for lots of different reasons that I've just outlined there. But yeah, the fact that we now genuinely have the global superpowers coming together, looking to tackle this problem, because they recognise that it's good for people, it's good for the economy, and it's just good for the globe going forward. It's good for the planet.
It's really true. Before we wrap up, you talk about the impact of the COP26 is going to have, and how it has to be everyone every day. If you have one wish of what would come out of COP26, or of what could be accomplished there, what would that be?
I think it is, my one wish for COP26 is that we do get that. We get that global commitment to coordination. I think that's really important, because you do run up against this whole issue of, well, why are we cutting emissions when other countries are perhaps still building coal power plants and all of that kind of and that is that's something that is really, really important. I think that's my one wish, is that out of COP is that we can work with other countries with less developed economies to help them take a different path, because we've proven that we can do it. And that's my big wish for COP, is that we can work with the less developed economies to be able to show them a growth trajectory that is not fossil based, and one that is so much kinder to the planet, and using that coordinated effort. I think that's been really, that would be the big one. Yeah.
COP26 as a coordinated effort. I love the idea. Thank you so much, Claire Mack, Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables, for joining me today for this very special Green Sofa Talk.
Thank you.
Bye.